Good evening and welcome back to our study on the book of Daniel, Hope for the Faithful. We are in lesson 4 this week, so we're in chapter 3, and we will be going to the fiery furnace. So we'll start with a review from last week. Last week we did the story of the vision of the four kingdoms, the king's dream, Nebuchadnezzar's dream. So can someone tell us what are some things that we learned from that vision of the four kingdoms story? Or just any thoughts you've had about it?
We had that whole chart of the head being Nebuchadnezzar, and then the next metal down was, I forget the names of them, but there were 3 different columns. One ends up with the Jewish people being the feet. One was Jesus as the feet, and the third was still a Jewish person or entity, but I can't really remember what that was.
Yeah. So those are the God's kingdom, the mountain, the rock cut from the mountain, not by human hands. Yeah. So the question, we had that vision and we saw 4 metals represent 4 kingdoms, kind of decreasing glory levels, with the idea that like these are a succession of kingdoms. And we heard that scholars disagree. Some of them end with that final one in the kingdom of Greece, like Alexander the Great, followed by the little splinter kingdoms that follow him, still Greece. Some by Rome that comes after. Some is like, no, this is that final kingdom represents Rome, because Rome is the kingdom that's in existence when Jesus is born and comes into the world. And then another was kind of, so those are like the Greek. One idea scholars have is like, this is the Greek ordering, this is the Roman ordering. And then the third is like, this is telling us something about the literature of Daniel, the progression in literature. 4 kings are mentioned in this first half of Daniel, and maybe it's talking about those 4 kings. So we saw that like we may have a favorite, and if so, I think that's okay. It's good because this God is telling us about real history, but that the point is not that we actually are tracking with a specific kingdom necessarily, but that we see that God is the one who brings up and takes down kingdoms, right? God sets up kings and deposes them. He changes times and epochs, so that God's sovereignty is such that he will bring about a succession of human kingdoms, and then he will bring his own kingdom, and that happens repeatedly through history and will happen fully at the conclusion of history. Does that make sense? Did anyone find that particularly unsatisfying, that we didn't like come down on us one interpretation? Okay, because you could. I think that could be unsatisfying, and if so, then I mean, certain scholars definitely have their opinions. You can always find someone to read who will have one of those opinions. What else? What else we learned
I
last
think
week?
the part. Oh,
No, go ahead,
so
please.
this is just a question. Prior to this last week, we had Daniel and his friends being promoted, and they ended up chapter 2, where Daniel petitioned the king. They set up Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego over affairs, and then Daniel sat at the gate. And then we come into chapter 3. Daniel's not even in the picture.
That's right.
Where did Daniel suddenly go?
Right.
Where did he suddenly go as we're going into this chapter?
Surely he's not out there just bowing to the statue, the image that Nebuchadnezzar sets up, right? Yeah. So what I think we're seeing, and we talked a little bit about how there seems to be maybe a time discontinuity between the first chapter and the second that we were trying to make sense of. Like, does this happen while they're still trainees? Or are we just not, like, are these stories just told in a way that they're not considering the timeline? Like, whatever way that this material came into the final form, maybe one was not written and necessarily in light of the other. And so I think that's what's happening here, is that we know that this Aramaic material had to have been written at a time when the Jews were all speaking Aramaic. And we know that in the time of Jesus, the common people were speaking Aramaic, but the religious and political elite were, always speaking Hebrew. And so what we think is that this is source material that was circulating in Aramaic, that the final author of Daniel brought together and arranged artistically. We talked last week about the ordering and how the ordering has that kind of mirror effect where it goes A, B, C, C, B, A. Remember that? That is in the notes on the study page and in the notes on the video if anybody wants to go back and look at that. And so someone arranged this with a goal of literary artistry. And so what we think is they took source material. This is a story that happened to be about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And so it wasn't a story that was about Daniel. These were pieces that were drawn together and placed in a final whole. So I think that's what's happening. I think that's why Daniel's not mentioned. Now, some people have speculated that this, we're going to get here in a second because we're going to talk about the plain of, we're going to read where it says they went to the plain of Dura. The plain of Dura is an unknown location. We don't know where that is. The Dur syllable means like fortress or wall. So think about how we have a lot of locations that are named Fort this and Fort that because they have a fort at them. In that period, there were a lot of locations that have Dur in the name. And so the plain of Dura could be one of a number of places. So the other speculation, maybe this is away from the capital, and that he set this up at this other place. Daniel's still at the capital. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego have been called out to this spectacle in the desert, is how it kind of reads, and Daniel wasn't there. So those are the two possibilities. Questions or comments on that? Okay. So, we saw with that vision of four kingdoms, that the king dreamed of an image and Daniel said, you, King of Kings, have been given dominion. And we saw this sort of thread that ran through, kind of pulled on that verse from Genesis, that mankind is made to image God, to have dominion and cooperation with God. And that's how you're supposed to do kingdoms. And we saw that human kingdoms did not do kingdoms that way. We're going to see that again today, right? Image is going to come up again, right? So we'll see that as we read. And we saw that making a name for yourself, as in Tower of Babel, as in King Nebuchadnezzar's habit, right, won't last because God will bring the kingdom not made with human hands, right? That cycle will happen. God will eventually bring justice. And then we looked at Daniel's prayer, his little poem that's embedded in the text. We talked about how when you find a poem embedded in the text, you can give it some extra attention, a little meditation time to see some of the themes that are brought out in that story. So between that and the interpretation of the dream, we found 4 themes that we'll be looking for as we proceed through Daniel. Anyone remember some of those themes?
He changes times and seasons.
Yeah, this idea of kings and kingdoms, that theme comes up over and over in Daniel, right? That verse, like he sets up kings and deposes them. Like kings and kingdoms are meant to reign under the sovereign rule of God. So those were 2 of our themes, kings and kingdoms and God's sovereignty, right? And what happens when kings try to reign outside God's sovereignty. Yeah, those are 2 of them.
He also reveals deep hidden things.
Right. In that poem, it's there, and then in Daniel's little poetic speech to the king, it's again, there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. Right? These visions and revelations, and over, God is showing the truth to people. God keeps communicating. He keeps coming to people, even evil, oppressive foreign kings. God is coming to and saying, let me show you what's true. Let me show you what's right. This happens over and over in Daniel. God continues to reveal mysteries. And so we have that idea of that's who God is. His nature and character is to communicate with us, to show himself to us, and to involve us in what he's doing in history. Yeah. And then one last theme.
God has wisdom and might, and he gives wisdom and might.
He gives wisdom and might to his faithful servants, right? So that theme of faithfulness, that God's people can and must remain faithful. There's a humility to Daniel we really see in that, we saw in last week's story, and we'll see that come out with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego tonight. This idea that God's servants are quietly resisting the worship of kings and kingdoms, human kings and kingdoms, and quietly trusting God, their faithfulness. Yeah.
That also
Okay.
seems to be kind of reiterated because he opens up the prayer with that and he ends it, kind of bracketing the whole prayer that way.
Yeah, you will sometimes see a pattern in sermons, TED Talks, school lessons, that ends with your application, right? And so that's what we see over and over again in Daniel, is that we have our clear sort of inspiration to also remain faithful. And that's probably why this book was written, is to inspire God's people to remain faithful to us. So yeah, that emphasis, like open with it and close with it, the application point. Yeah. And we don't want to fail to take that to heart, right? Because we live as foreigners in a strange land, in some ways of thinking. We'll talk more about that tonight. Okay, let's read the first part of chapter 3. Would someone read verses 1 through 12, please?
I'll read.
Thank you.
King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold whose height was 60 cubits and its breadth 6 cubits. He set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then King Nebuchadnezzar sent together the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the province gathered for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And the herald proclaimed aloud, "You are commanded, O Nebuchadnezzar, You are commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace." Therefore, as soon as all the peoples heard the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, all the peoples, nations, and languages fell down and worshiped the golden image of the king Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Therefore, at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and maliciously accused the Jews. They declared to King Nebuchadnezzar, "O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that every man who hears the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music shall fall down and worship the golden image. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into a burning fiery furnace. There are certain Jews who have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, pay no attention to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up.
Thank you. Yes, thank you. Okay. So what has Nebuchadnezzar made?
Golden statue.
A golden statue? Any other different words for statue?
Probably
image is what they.
It's literally image. It's tselem. It's that same word we talked about last week for the golden image in the dream, for the image of God that God has created and given dominion. Yeah, he's made an image. It's gold. It's 60 cubits is 90 feet high. It's a 1.5 multiplier, so it's 90 feet high. This is feeling kind of familiar, right? A really big gold image. So what do you all notice?
There are no lesser materials in it. It's all gold.
It's all gold, right? So ancient interpreters sort of wondered if Nebuchadnezzar was maybe inspired by his dream and thought that he'd just capitalize that and just make some kind of image that is all gold, right? None of these lesser materials. He's focused on himself and his kingdom, right? What does it say about the image? What do we learn about it? We've got its height and its width. What else?
Its width isn't very wide.
No, it's so tall and skinny that it's been speculated that it's more like an obelisk, or like it's a pillar and maybe only the top is carved, or you got to wonder, right? What else?
It's out in the middle of the desert, so all the people can come and worship it.
Yeah, he's just, it seems like the plains of Dura, we don't know, but it sounds like it's a random location that he's set up for this purpose. What else?
It's all gold, which is what he is in the dream, the head.
Yeah. What's it of? Like, is it Nebuchadnezzar? Is it his god? Is it a calf? Is it a...
It doesn't really say.
It doesn't say, right?
Yeah.
It mentions it so many times, and yet it manages not to describe the image in any other way except it keeps repeating a certain phrase over and over again. What does it say about the image?
Nebuchadnezzar had set up.
That he had set it up, right? This is what it tells us. He had set it up. It actually says it 9 times in this passage that Nebuchadnezzar has set up this image of gold. Why do you think this phrase is repeated so many times?
Well, for those 3, it is a setup.
Okay. That's kind of an English play on words.
Yeah.
But I do think so. The spirit of that is that's what we're looking for. We're looking for why it's chosen why this wording has been chosen, and what it's supposed to be. What thread is it pulling on? What does it mean?
It's pulling on the thread that God sets up kings and takes them down, and he's directly
right. Same word that was used last chapter multiple times. It is he who changes times and epochs. He removes kings and sets up kings. He gives wisdom to, so he sets up kings, same word there in verse 21. Also in 239, it says there will be another kingdom set up.
Yeah.
What's that?
You had frozen for a little bit.
Oh, I did. Okay. Well, it's in 221. And then it's again in 239, and it's again in 244. So 3 times in chapter 2, we have this idea that God from heaven will set up a kingdom. But here we see Nebuchadnezzar has set up an image of his own, right? So Nebuchadnezzar's doing God's job, setting himself as sovereign, right? So we really get that view of Nebuchadnezzar, not in reverence to God, but you know, trying to take the place of God, which by now we know Nebuchadnezzar to know him well enough to say, yeah, that sounds about right for him, right? Okay, so who has he summoned?
Everyone.
So many words, right? It's the whole government, which is represented by this long, elaborate list of officials. And these words for these officials, some of them are words that would have come from later periods, characteristically, than this setting in which this is set, which is one of the reasons people used to argue for later authorship. But it's like there needed to be a really long list. This author really likes these long lists. What effect do you think, literary effect, do you think these lists have?
It's over the top.
Yeah, it's like spectacle, right? There's a sense of excess that runs through this chapter, right? He's summoned all these types of officials, and same thing with the musical instruments, right? Some of those words are hard to translate, and so they'll be translated differently in different versions, and some of them would have come from later periods, maybe. And so, but we get this idea that he's really drawing out a sense of spectacle using this technique of these long repeated lists, right? So what's king's decree? What's the rule? What are they supposed to do?
When they hear the music, they're all supposed to bow down and worship the likeness of, well, what we assume is the likeness of Nebuchadnezzar.
Nebuchadnezzar or his god or whatever he says, right?
Mm-hmm.
So now they're all supposed to fall down and worship. That another phrase that's used 4 times. This is the same phrase. Remember at the end of chapter 2, when Nebuchadnezzar is so impressed with Daniel's telling of the dream and the interpretation, he falls down and worships. And he says, surely your God is the God of gods. Well, here, same phrase, they're all to fall down and worship. So we're really tying back into those same themes, right? Is the assumption that all these people, and so we have all these government officials, but then in verse 7, it says, as soon as the peoples heard, so it seems that there are people groups there. Maybe the officials come with their retinue, or maybe large groups of people were to come and the officials were to represent them. Is the assumption that everyone will want to worship this image automatically?
Yes. Well,
They'll
no, because he's put this big decree that you're going to burn in a fiery pit.
Right, so he's pre-provided an active furnace for the express purpose of forcing compliance, right? There's already a threat included with the original decree. So we know everyone must not want to do this. And why wouldn't people want to do this? Now, I don't mean Jews, because we're going to talk about Jews, specifically, but there are a lot of people groups here, right? Why wouldn't people want to do it?
They may have their own local gods.
Right.
They have their own gods. What I heard, Chris. Who else spoke?
I was going to say these people are coming from all over, so they probably have other things they're trying to take care of just in life in general.
Right, but they got to go out to the plain of Dura to bow to the statue when they hear the cacophony, right? What else?
I would think that they're probably conquered peoples.
Yeah.
And so this is being forced upon them, the whole different, who wants to worship the conqueror?
Who wants to worship the conqueror, right? The conqueror has to force people to worship them. That's what the conquering is about, right? So Babylon has gone into all of these different places, not just Jerusalem, not just Israel, but all of these places, and conquered and brought people back into exile. And we know that it is not like a beneficent rule completely, because we've seen that Nebuchadnezzar can fly into a rage just because he didn't sleep well. He had a dream he can't remember, and so heads are going to roll, right? Like, this is the type of atmosphere that they're in. And so these people groups have been forcibly, taken from their homeland and are now being forced to bow to the Babylonian culture, right? Nebuchadnezzar is making a name for himself, as we saw, like in the Tower of Babel way of saying it, right? They're the imperial force. This is the national identity. They want allegiance to themselves and no other, right? These other nations don't want to be under Babylon's rule, but they are. So the point isn't what the shape of the image is, but that Nebuchadnezzar has set it up. He has established what's to be worshiped. He has established who's in charge. He's established what's right and what's wrong. And wrong in his eyes, not worshiping the national identity of Babylon here, bears this horrific penalty before even anyone has a chance to do it or not do it, right? Babylon insists on your allegiance. That's the message, right? And this is what the world does, doesn't it? It wants us to pledge our allegiance to all of these things that are not God. So, verse 7, of course, with the threat of the blazing furnace there hanging over them, everyone does, in fact, fall down and worship the image of gold that Nebuchadnezzar has set up. But what happens in verse 8?
Some jealous Chaldeans that go tattle to Nebuchadnezzar about the 3 little Jews that didn't bow down.
Okay. So there was a lot in there. You said the jealous Chaldeans. So some of your translations may say astrologers, and some may say Chaldeans. This is a word for the ethnic group, Chaldeans, but it's also used for the professional group, astrologers. So it could be translated either way, and you may have it either way in your different translations. And, as you point out, they're pandering to the king. What do they say? How do they kiss up to the king?
May the king live forever.
Right? Oh, king, live forever. This was a standard greeting for a king because you're expected to kiss up to a king, right? And they're definitely pandering. What else? How do you know they're jealous?
They're doing this maliciously, accusing them.
Okay. That word maliciously is a funny. Some of your translations will say denounced, some will say brought charges. It literally comes in an idiom that is hard to translate. It's like eat their pieces. They came to eat their pieces. I tried to come up with a way to like map that onto something we have in English, but I didn't come up with it. So if y'all do, let me know. But anyway, they denounce these Jews. They say, you have set Jews over the affairs of the province of Babylon. And they, verse 12, they don't do 3 things. What are the 3 things they don't do?
They don't pay attention to the king. They don't serve his gods, and they don't worship the image of gold
He has set up. Yes.
Mhm.
So they've equated these things, right? If you don't worship the image of gold, you've got no respect for the king, right? You don't pay any attention to the king. So it's a way of needling in there, right? But it's also it says what we know Nebuchadnezzar was after all along. He wants the adulation, he wants the adoration, he wants the allegiance of the crowds. And in fact, he insists on it. And they say, these Jews aren't doing it. Okay. Someone read 13 through 23 for us.
Furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king, and Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I have set up? Now, when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, if you are ready to fall down and worship the image I have made, very good. But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand?" Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, "King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up." Then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude toward them changed. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual, and commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So these men, wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. The king's command was so urgent and the furnace so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace.
Thank you. Okay. So, what is Nebuchadnezzar's big challenge to them? Right? He comes in, he's furious with rage again. He's furious with rage a lot, right? And what is his challenge to them in verse 15?
I think that he thought maybe it was just a misunderstanding and he was giving them an opportunity to save face and get with the program. He even explained the rules.
Right, right. He's like, and here's the furnace. I'm really going to do it. So let's see if you're really going to resist. Right. Yeah.
Yeah, you kind of wonder if he's upset about it, but like hoping that he doesn't have to do it just because these are his guys that he's set up here on this level over everybody, and he has to burn them. He's kind of losing faith in some ways with others because he's the one that put them in that position.
Good point. On the other hand, he seems pretty okay with burning whoever he wants to burn.
He definitely has a short temper.
Yeah. He's furious with rage. And look at his big challenge that his speech ends with. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand, right? This is the big money question, the challenge that sets up the rest of the chapter, right? The rest of the chapter is an answer to the question, what God will be able to do this thing, right? So let's talk about how Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego handle this, right? Most people have just gone ahead with worshiping. They're not worshiping. Why not?
They're faithful to their God.
Okay. You broke up a little bit. Say the first part again.
They remain faithful to their God.
They're faithful to their faithfulness is to their God, right? What do they say about their God?
They say their God can deliver him from them.
But even if he doesn't, that's okay.
Yeah.
Right? So there's a sense here that God is able to save. They seem completely confident in the matter, don't they? But even if he doesn't choose to, you aren't God, and we know it, is what's implied, right? We're not bowing down to you. Whether or not God chooses to save, we're not bowing down to your image. What kind of tone do you imagine here?
Well, I like verse 18.
Okay.
Even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. I mean, it's kind of hard for them to do so if they're dead, but they don't think they're going to be.
Well, they're not going to do it upon threat, right? Of
Right.
being dead, right? That's not enough. The threat of death is not enough to make them bow down and worship. Yeah. What kind of tone do you hear in it?
In a calm tone.
It seems calm, doesn't it? What else? What other words were y'all thinking?
There's
Definitely a challenge.
yeah.
I mean, Nebuchadnezzar said, "What God can save you?" And they said, "Ours can."
Ours can.
He
Yeah.
might not, but he can.
Yeah. It's calm, but it's resistance, right?
That's a
They
good
seem to
point.
be quite polite, don't they? Think
Mhm.
about the kinds of forms that resistance often takes in various situations, right? What kinds of resistance are there?
Well, there's armed resistance and there are peaceful protests. And
Okay.
there are times when you just kind of stand and glare at each other, without doing anything.
Okay.
So everything in between.
Other thoughts? So, there could be argument, you could make a case against bowing. They specifically say that they don't need a comeback on this. They don't need to mount an argument. There could be protests, the modern equivalent would be like, they're marching with their signs, no golden image, we won't bow. But we don't see anything like that, right? There's no attempt to bring others to this cause. They're not violent, right? They don't fight. They don't make a scene out of not bowing. Do you think Nebuchadnezzar would even have known that they weren't bowing if it weren't for the tattletales? Right? It seems like he's just like, everyone's bowing, things are great. And then these Chaldeans come up and say some people aren't bowing, right? So, um, and the other form, kind of the opposite of resistance that we sometimes see is withdrawal, like move out to the desert, don't everyone boycott the plain of Jura, like go, make a society of just Jews. But what is Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's jobs? What are their jobs?
To serve the king.
Right? They work in the Babylonian government. So they haven't withdrawn, they haven't fought, they haven't protested, they haven't argued, but they definitely have not complied, right? They are still resisting. They refuse allegiance to the image. They do it politely, but they do it, right? They quietly and kind of matter of fact, I think I heard someone say, they say, we know God, you're not him. That's how it is. And we'll see what happens, right? So Nebuchadnezzar appears to get even more furious, right? Like I feel like the author is maybe like exhausting his vocabulary, trying to tell us about these ever escalating levels of rage, right? And it says, I noticed Chris's versions was NIV. His attitude towards them changed. Verse 19. Does anyone have anything else?
Nebuchadnezzar was filled with fury, and expression of his face was changed.
Expression of his face was changed. Okay. It sounds weird because it's an idiom and it's hard to translate, but it's the selim, it's the image of his face. So we've been hearing about the image he set up all this time, but the image of his face collapsed, changed, was not under his control, right? He is trying to do the image setting up thing, but he cannot control the image of his face or the image of, someone's face is their presence in biblical. Like if you're in the presence of the king, you're at the face, you're before the face of the king. If you're in the presence of God, you're before the face of God. So like his own presence, his own image, he lost it, right? He lost control of it. So we're signaling a turning point here, right? The king has lost control. What signs do we see of overkill in verses 19 through 21?
He wants the
Time.
furnace 7 times hotter.
He
Okay,
tied him up
furnace-
before he threw him in it. You know, the furnace wasn't enough to kill him. They had to be tied up.
Yeah.
To be burned to death.
Okay, they had to be tied up to be burned to death. The furnace had to be 7 times hotter. Like it was already hot enough to burn people, but now it's 7 times hotter. Why 7? What are we doing with the number 7?
I was wondering that myself.
What does 7 usually signal in biblical language?
All of it.
All of it, completion. Like he's completely overheated the furnace. Like it's gone to it. We might say he's pushed it to level 10, or we could even say 11, right? And by saying 11, we would say past is what we're thinking is like 110% completely. He's complete overkill on the hottest of the furnace. Who had to tie them up?
The soldiers.
Mm-hmm.
The strongest soldiers, the NIV says. Some other versions will talk about mighty, valiant warriors. This is the word, the Gibborim are the mighty men. David had mighty men. There are mighty men that show up in Genesis. These are the mighty men of valor, are called the toughest of the tough, his strongest, mighty, valiant warriors, to tie up these 3 polite government officials, right? Nebuchadnezzar has lost it. It's overkill, right? And we see that they're still in their full formal Babylonian outfits, right? They're not transferred to holding. No, they're tied up on the spot, still in their formal wear. And what does it mean that the command of the king was so urgent? What are we talking about there? Now?
Not now, but right now.
It has to be now, right? Do you imagine he says that in the tone we're saying it in?
He's kind of lost his cool.
He needs to have lost his cool, right? This is literally so harsh. It's the same word when remember when the executioner comes to find Daniel and his friends to execute them too, because nobody can tell the dream, and Daniel questions him and says, why is the command of the king so harsh? This is the same word. The command of the king was so harsh that. So, I'm thinking, like, how do you take valiant warriors and have them die from throwing someone in a furnace, right? Do they just keep walking forward when it's too hot to live through, or do they try to get away? What's a person's instinct when you're going towards a heat that is too hot to live through? And so my imagination conjures up a scene where Nebuchadnezzar is screaming insistence, and the soldiers in the back are pushing the ones in the front forward, desperately trying to save themselves by getting the command of the king accomplished. I don't know if that's true. That's how I envision these men dying. At this point, we're seeing this is the nature of the human kingdom trying to make a name for itself, of setting itself up as sovereign instead of God. Lives don't matter near as much as trying to pretend you're in control of the image, right? So we see that this is the cheapness, of the anger of the king that can cost him his most valiant warriors has pushed him over into this behavior that's completely out of the realm of the goodness of dominion that we want from a king.
He's like a
Let's
full-grown
look at
2-year-old.
25 through 30. Oh, comments?
I said he's like a full-grown 2-year-old.
I don't know.
Actually, 3. 3 was
Worse somehow.
full-grown 3-year-old.
Okay. in that he just wants what he wants and he doesn't care who it hurts. But he also seems mature enough to have more malice than that too.
The live that Kevin Humphreys used to do, John was King Nebuchadnezzar, and he sang Johnny Cash's "Ring of Fire." Yeah. But
that is great.
On the furnace front, I did a glass blowing class when I was in college.
Yeah.
And the furnace there, the furnace is so hot you have to wear special clothing on your hands and your arms to protect yourself from the heat. But also the way you approach the furnace, you don't stand in front of it. You kind of come at it from the side, and the hole is only like that big that you're able to put your glass through when you're working in the furnace. So you're kind of off to the side, and I kind of imagine like most likely what's happened is there's some kind of a door to the furnace that protects you, and upon opening it, it allows that heat out and just incinerates the people.
Yeah, I think that's a great vision. There's quite a bit of speculation on how this furnace must have been built, because it seems like there's an opening at the top, which there has to be. It has to be vented at the top, right? So maybe they throw them in from the top, but then later there's a door where they're usually like stocking, adding fuel that they walk out of later. Like this is, there's a lot of interesting question mark on like, how is this furnace shaped? What is this? How is this done? But yeah, I think, and yeah, I took just a half day glass blowing class once. So interesting. And like it was the dead of winter. It was very cold outside, but the whole room was like, tank top hot, even in the far corners, because of this. You come in wearing your winter clothes and you're like, oh, okay, we're going to take off some layers. And then the people working there were all in there like, that were in tank tops and shorts, and you're like, I didn't prepare for this. Yes, it heated all around. Yeah, great point.
There's a type of kiln that's been used for a long time called a beehive kiln, which is shaped like a dome, and then you've got the ventilation through the top, but then you also have the door on the side, and that might be kind of what it is.
Yeah,
it's got set up
and big enough to throw 3 people in.
Yeah,
with their turbans.
Yeah,
and maybe the people are dying and getting it hot enough, because you have to go. It's already going, and you're having to get it hotter, so you're having to put more fuel in it somehow.
Yeah,
So
it doesn't exactly say, doesn't it? It's just that it's so hot that it killed the soldiers who took them. Yeah. So let's look at 25 through 30. 24 through 30. Then King Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire? They replied, certainly, O king. Like, do you ever say no to this king? Right? Like, if Nebuchadnezzar says, isn't it so? You say, yes, it's so, right? Because he's busy throwing people into the flames. He said, look, I see 4 men walking in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods. Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here. Their status has changed. Now they aren't, don't you want to change your mind and bow? Now they have he's calling them out by the name, servants of the Most High God. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire, and the satraps, prefects, governors, and royal advisors crowded around them, right? We saw the whole list of people was there for the spectacle before, and they were all there to bow, but now they're witnesses, aren't they? they come in and they witness. They trusted, they saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair of their head singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. Then Nebuchadnezzar said, Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king's command, and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore I decree to the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be cut into pieces, and their houses be turned into piles of rubble. For no other God can save in this way. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. Okay, what do you notice?
His over the topness is swung to the other side.
Yeah, now it's praise the Most High God, right?
Yeah, but still not in a really great way that God would be happy for.
Okay, why? What is he? What's the problem with his?
He's still seeing himself as equal to God. I mean, he'll recognize God, but he doesn't see that as being beneath him.
Right, he'll just threaten other people on God's behalf.
Yeah,
it's his own special skill, right? It's his special talent to threaten to kill people and turn their houses into piles of rubble, right? So he's like, I'll do that on your behalf too, God, because I'm not magnanimous, right? Yeah, definitely. There's a little bit of a disconnect in his recognition of the true God and his godness, right? Yeah. And we're going to see that play out in next chapter that we study next week, right? Because we'll be back with Nebuchadnezzar next week. What else?
Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego got a promotion.
They did. They are now working higher in the Babylonian government. Right? It's oh yay, right? Still serving this government that they won't worship, right? Such a fine line to walk. Such a challenge to serve and work for the good of this place and yet refuse it your full allegiance and reserve that only for God. Yeah. What else? The money question has been answered, right? What God will be able to save you from my hand? What does he say?
The Most High God.
Right? Only this one. No other God, verse 29, can save in this way, right? That's the answer. Question and answer has been provided. What about what's going on with this fourth man?
it's interesting that they're not questioning where the fourth man is. Only 3 come out.
Only 3 come out. Only 3 go in. Only 3 come out. How does Nebuchadnezzar describe them to start with? The fourth man.
The Son of God.
Mm-hmm.
The Son of God. Yeah. This is a way, a Son of God or Son
Let's
of
have that in
God.
plural, because mine is like not the son of God, but the son of gods. Which then makes
It
me think
is
it's like Achilles,
it's a plural word, but it is it's a quirk of grammar that the plural is used and sometimes it means singular and sometimes it means plural. It's kind of like sheep might be a sheep or it might be sheep. It's literally the word is pluralized. It has the s on the end, only it's I think it's which word does it use? I could look. It's a plural word, but it doesn't, you could go either way with it. And so it provides that question, right? That provides, Elohim would be the equivalent. Like we're used to hearing Elohim as a word for God, but it actually, im is a plural in Hebrew. This is Aramaic. This is the Aramaic equivalent. So it provides a little bit of mystery. Who is this fourth person that looks like the Son of God or the Son of Gods?
It's me to think it's Jesus. Fiery.
Say that again, Bethany.
I said it makes me think that it's Jesus. Yeah, the implication there.
Yeah, so this son of the gods would be a way of just of talking about any divine being. Sometimes angels were described in this way, and later Nebuchadnezzar does call it an angel, sent his angel. Mm-hmm. And yet this way of writing, the way the author has chosen to write this, reminds us of there are several instances across the Old Testament where we get a person who comes as a messenger from God, but is also addressed as God and sometimes at times receives worship. And so there are these instances across the Old Testament where we have kind of in some way a representative of God that is a manifestation of the presence of God. And we can talk about that as the pre-incarnate Jesus before he took on human flesh, or in some other ways. But yeah, what we have is in some way the presence of God with them, through a messenger or in himself. It's left mysterious, but somehow the presence of God is with them in the fire. What does that mean to us?
It should be comforting.
Yeah, it is comforting. Did God save them from having to get thrown in?
No. But he went
They
in there.
got tied up and thrown in. What's that?
But he went in there with them.
But he was there with them. And so God's power didn't look like a violent deliverance, right? There was no bolt of lightning that hit the soldiers so that they could escape before they got thrown in. They had to go all the way to the flames, right? All the way in. And yet God's deliverance was just his presence there with them was enough to save. That's how God works in our lives. He's with us. Sometimes we go through the fires, but he goes along with us, and his presence is enough to help us, to be with us, to save, right? I think in that thought of Jesus as the representative, it took me to a passage from Colossians, the first chapter of Colossians 1:13 through 17. It says, "For he has rescued us from the domain of darkness," right? Darkness where kings can create a fire so hot and a command so harsh that his own valiant warriors are killed, right? Or darkness where our own sorrows overwhelm us, or where we're in the horrors of this world. It's sometimes horrible, because that's what human kingdoms do to make a name for themselves. He rescued us from the domain of darkness and transferred us to the kingdom of his beloved Son, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins. He, his beloved Son, Jesus, is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For by him all things were created, both in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. We see that Jesus is the perfect image of God, the one who is set up. He's exalted to kingship, but he's exalted to kingship through becoming a lowly human and being put on a cross by humans for humans. He's all the way with us in the suffering of the world. He's the perfect image of God in that way. That's how God acts. That's his character, is to be with us. And we get to be images after him in the way of Jesus as well, right? We're citizens not of the earthly kingdom, the Babylons, all the way through scripture, Babylon is used sometimes just metaphorically to mean the human kingdoms that are trying to make a name for themselves, right? We are citizens not of the earthly kingdom, but the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of God's beloved Son. And yet here we are in the kingdoms of the world, and thus we're described as ambassadors for Christ. That's in 2 Corinthians 5:20. We're citizens of one place, representing that place while living in another, right? We live in Jesus's way, images of God as we're created to be in the earthly kingdom. And our way is like the way of these three men. We notice they have grown up, right? They're not youths anymore. They're described as men now. They have matured so that they are able to walk this so fine line of working for the good of their earthly place, but resisting allegiance to it, keeping their allegiance to heaven, and just being able to say, our God is the true God, and we'll only serve him. So that's the way we're given, and sometimes it takes us through the flames, but God is with us in that. Thank y'all for bearing with me. I've just been thinking a lot about this lesson and the way that it works, and the character that God has. It's beautiful. It's very touching. Next week we'll be in Daniel 4. We'll be back with King Nebuchadnezzar. We will see that he is very short-sighted, right? He does not learn his lesson. His memory is quite short. And we'll see he's back in trouble again next week. So questions or comments from tonight?
I thought it was interesting because when they were in the fiery furnace, about Meshach and Abednego, when King Nebuchadnezzar had come out, they did not smell of stench. It would look like that they had no fire around them or anything.
Yeah, they didn't even get sweaty. I don't know, maybe. No smell of fire was on them.
But their bounds were burnt. I mean, they didn't have any ropes on them anymore. That was interesting.
Right? Did they fall off? Were they burned up? Did they? Yeah. The valiant warriors tied them. They had to have been good knots. Yeah.
I would like to think that bagpipes were actually there. I'm reading it. I'm like, really, bagpipes?
That's another. Those are so hard to translate, and so they're different in all the different translations. And some of the words, we're like, I don't even. If that's an instrument, I don't even know that instrument. Yeah, they just had to really scrounge it up so they could have a really long list, because they love those long lists.
What, you don't play the zithar? I mean, come on.
It must have been some kind of festival.
Mm-hmm.
It does seem like it, because, you've got, it sounds like a lot of people and music. So, bound to be.
My translation just says pipes instead of bagpipes. But
yeah,
bagpipes were not limited to Scotland and Ireland. So, I mean, they were in other cultures as well. We just try to limit them as much as possible because of their popularity.
Yeah.
And I've known several pipers in my life, yes.
Okay, thanks everyone. Shall we do our prayers? I will shut off the recording and we can do prayer requests.